So it's
Again,
fun. It's funny you mentioned that because right, the kind of the next thing I wanted to roll into right was there was a brand new RFP that the Pentagon put forth right where they're
sure.
soliciting, looking for ideas for R&D projections, technical capabilities, demonstrated experiences in cybersecurity and cyberspace operations, right? And so I think that leads very nicely into a conversation that even with CISA and now with the Pentagon, one of the questions that I get asked very much, and I'd like your perspective on this as well, is, there's I believe what people see is that there's a misconception that the U.S. government is incredibly armed in protecting us from cyber threats. And so when we look at CISA getting stood up and funded, and we look at the Pentagon standing up, it's Pentagon, or I mean, it's planning for the next 25 years and looking for these types of
Hmm.
information. Do you think that the U.S. is prepared for a cyber attack, and are we giving a false sense of security by having an organization like CISA in place?
Ooh, that's a that's a loaded question, right? Do I think we're prepared for a cyber attack? Um, I think I don't know that anybody's prepared for a cyber attack. I think the U.S. is in a better position than we were a decade ago, and that's really low hanging fruit to say something like that, right?
Sure.
We're not there yet, I suppose. I'm not the best expert on this. We do have others on the subject, obviously, that are more connected to specifics here. But I think if you look at where we've gone over the last several years, U.S. Cyber Command was a big step forward. I think it took time. It's still developing. I think JFCCW maturing into that was a big move. But every time you stand up these new organizations, there's a lot of challenges. There's challenges in figuring out where you fit within the landscape with other organizations, because you're probably stealing somebody's mission. U.S. Cyber Command and NSA, for instance, trying to sort some of that out. So you figure out where that fits. You also have to find the manpower. And a lot of times when agencies are stood up, if we're being really frank about it, the early manpower comes from other agencies.
Mm-hmm.
And, let's be realistic. You don't give your best superstars away. So a lot of times new agencies are formed based on people who are volunteered to be sent there, which isn't necessarily your top people. So you have some times to develop, and some are, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to badmouth everybody who went to a new agency.
Sure.
Some are looking for new challenges and new opportunities, and you get some really strong people in there. Normally that's the really high leadership. It's your mid-levels that tend to take time to mature, in my experience at least. So I think we're on our path, right? If a strong nation state wanted to attack us right now, my understanding is that, we're probably at risk in a lot of different areas. There's other mechanisms for defending against that, though, right? We're sort of in a mutually assured destruction scenario like we were with the Soviets when you talk about nuclear, warfare. We haven't said what a declaration of war is or what an act of war is in cyber.
That's right.
I think a lot of people feel like they know what it would be, but then again, I might have thought interfering with an election would have been on the list. So
no politics on stream.
Yeah, I'm not interested in that. I speak about that strictly from an intel standpoint.
Sure, right.
There are some
Absolutely.
things that are, 17 agencies agree something happened. I'm not going to get into any of the politics on the subject.
Right.
But I think we're better. We're not there yet. Obviously, if we were there, we wouldn't be launching new agencies and having new initiatives.
Right.
And the other issue is that adversaries are getting better and changing. So, even if we think we are in a position where we can reasonably defend against a nation state's efforts combined with our political opportunities and economic opportunities, and if God forbid, kinetic response, are we prepared for somebody who's not a nation state? Are we prepared for a really technically advanced rogue actor or technically advanced rogue group? Are we prepared for true cyber terrorism? Where what do you do? Who are you going to bomb? Who are you going to sanction when something like that happens? I suspect we're not prepared for that quite yet.
It's awesome that you bring up the lack of a definition of cyber war, and I've brought this up on streams on streams in the past as well, because I think you used the right term, and I hadn't heard that term used out loud outside of a circle of close friends, right? Is mutually assured destruction, right? Is we're afraid to make the definition of what an act of cyber war is, because we know that it's already been done against us and we've already done it against other organizations. And so by putting a definition to it, we're admitting something that has technically been highly clandestine for a number of years.
Well, yeah, there's no doubt about that. I won't go into details on what we have or haven't done, but I think when you put a label on it, you open yourself up to be responsible for that same label, right?
Right.
And I think the Wild West has existed for a long time in cyber, and there's a lot of things going on that if we sat and agreed on a hard and fast definition internationally, which is also hard to do.
Right.
The Russians and the Chinese have pushed for several years a different set of global rules for the internet and how we would define these things than the West have been pushing. But if we got to an agreement, I have no doubt that we would all have to also agree to absolve each other of things that have happened prior to that agreement.
The past is the past, right?
Yeah, well, and you do end up doing that to a point, right? I mean, that's the nature of all of these things. If there are no rules, there are no rules, and when you make them, you can't retrospectively go after people.
Right.
I suspect before the Geneva Convention, some horrible things happened. After the conventions, I doubt we went and prosecuted people for things that happened before the conventions. And I sort of look at it the same way here. I don't know that we're ever going to get there, though, to be honest. I think the way the West, and to make it simple, the way the West and the East see these things is very different. We have different cultures. Forgetting about political reasons why we might see things differently. We have different cultures. We have different ideas of what right and wrong are. And it doesn't make one right or one wrong. I'm not going to go down that path with people. But we do see the world differently, and differently enough that it's hard to find common ground in that area. And the internet is, that's everything to everybody right now. It's a problem.
Real quick on this, though, when we get back to the kind of the funding and the Pentagon planning for this, do you think that funding should be included in these types of endeavors to augment or to help secure certain private sector businesses that have been deemed critical assets? So things like the power grid, things like the financial institution, things where you can't push your beliefs onto them. You can't say, you must be regulated to do X, because then that private entity comes back and says, well, if you government are making me do it, you have to subsidize the cost of it. And so should the government take the initiative to try to find funding to go ahead and try to push that funding down to private sectors, especially those that are deemed critical infrastructure, to try to secure them in an initiative like this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, you almost walk down the path of where's the line of nationalization then? If we're going to go all the way down the path of saying these are critical infrastructure, these are vital to national security, they're private enterprise, we can't make them do things, so we're going to go ahead and pay and then force them to do things we paid for. That's corporate socialism at a minimum,
right?
And it may be walking us down a path towards nationalism. And I don't say that necessarily as a negative. Now, I got to be careful about this. I want people to understand I'm very much an American. I served in the military and I believe in our democracy and our system. But we have to really be realistic, I think, when we talk about where national security fits in and critical infrastructure. I don't know that we end up having to private or having to bring everything into the government and nationalize things. I think private enterprise has a place. But we may have to create stronger incentives to force some of these things to happen. I don't know that I'm excited about the idea of the government paying for all those things to happen as much as incentivizing. And it could be as much as dealing with, other government contracts and creating a situation where there's an economic advantage because you give companies advantages in that area, or it could be, rather significant penalties and fines when things go wrong. I've been a big believer in that for a long time in the defense contracting space specifically. But I don't know the answer to this, what we're going to find. I'm not going to pretend I'll solve it here in this discussion. But ultimately, the government's going to have to be able to tell these private sector companies that are considered vital parts of national security, things that just have to happen. We have to recognize that we are sort of in a state of war in cyber all the time. Right. So, for these organizations, and there's a lot of them that are critical infrastructure, what would we tell them to do if we were actually at combat war? Right. If we were in kinetic warfare right now, the nation rallies, the government takes control of a lot of things during that time frame. We may need to look at the idea of that being a constant state when it comes to cyber, and then figure out where we draw those lines. So I think it'll be uncomfortable for a lot of people. Well, so as we do that,
it's interesting you bring up the war fact, right? Because when we go back over to CISA, right, they were founded under the Defense Authorization Act, right, the same one that was enacted to try to force private organizations to make equipment during this pandemic. Yep. If CISA was authorized under the National Defense Act and they were partnering with local governments and private sector businesses, is it plausible to assume that potentially, to your point, if we were actually inside of a declared cybersecurity war, by the Pentagon, they could use the National Defense Authorization Act to, have private industry worked at the behest of the government?
Yeah, I'm not a legal expert,
Sure,
so I
sure.
got to
No,
claim
no.
that up
You
front.
didn't stay at a
Obviously,
Holiday Inn last night, did you? Right?
that's right. My understanding of the law suggests that that's true. I'd certainly bring up somebody better on law than myself, but my understanding of it from what I've read is that the government can do that. The authorities that the president is empowered with specifically, when it comes to the National Defense Act, are incredibly powerful. That's one of the things I think a lot of us have started to learn here with what's going on with the pandemic. You learn a lot of things you didn't pay attention to before. There's a pretty wide swath of power that goes along with that. I'm inclined to believe, from what I've read, that the government could take over significant enterprises and just push them where they need to go. I mean, the government's capable of telling, automotive companies that you're now going to build respirators. That's something I didn't even realize was a possibility, but they actually can force that to happen. So I'd be inclined to think, based on that logic, that they'd be able to do a lot more things than we realize right now, which includes this. So I think, yeah, the government could step in and force, power companies and water companies and all these other infrastructure companies, telecommunications companies. And I think that brings up all sorts of serious concerns when you talk about Fourth Amendment rights, data privacy. Could the government theoretically abuse the National Defense Act to get full access to an entire network that they wouldn't otherwise have access to, and say they're doing it under the guise of national defense, and then as a result, target U.S. citizens or some things way down the
Well,
path.
that's. I was gonna say that's a little deep on the paranoid side. Let's that'll be. I promise. That's as deep as we'll go on the politics there for everybody. That's. But I think I think you bring up some valid points, right? Is we're in uncharted territory when it comes to the government's kind of fingers being played in the private sector as it pertains to cybersecurity. And so I think that's